While console dominance of Nintendo has come and gone, one thing that has always been the company's ace in the hole is its handheld offerings. From even before the NES, Nintendo was a clear cut above the rest with the Game & Watch from the 1980s all the way to the Switch in the 2020s. When other game companies' portable consoles have come and gone, Nintendo's handhelds have always had a secret sauce that mainly comes from how its handheld titles are designed. In a way to make these systems accessible, Nintendo has seldom had the cutting-edge technical power, but the DNA of these games are magnificent for making the most out of the portable sessions without ever needing to have the most powerful hardware. Even with the hybrid nature of the Nintendo Switch, its flagship titles still accommodate simpler and smaller bursts of play, whether it be a micro-dungeon shrine in Breath of the Wild, or a colorful quest for a moon in Super Mario Odyssey. However, in the more simpler times of handheld development, arcade style was king, even if it wasn't a straight conversion of an arcade stand-up or sit-down machine. And with Nintendo Game Boy's first years of existence, they were facing off with a company where arcade gameplay was their bread and butter. Coming in from an angle of technologically superior hardware, Sega released the Game Gear a little over a year after the Game Boy to compete. With a better batting average and success than Atari's attempts both with the 7800 and the handheld Lynx, Sega's new Game Gear would go against the Game Boy as the main opposition. There was only one problem. Well, 6 of them to be precise. Yes, despite the higher cost of the Game Gear with its backlit color screen, the real cost would be from its consumption of AA batteries, and its ability to deplete said batteries within about 3 hours. Of course, there was still the ability to play these games from a power source on the wall, but that takes some of the ability out of the portability. And on top of that, the Game Gear doesn't fit very well in your pocket for casual carrying. It's this writing on the wall that spelled instant doom for the supremacy of the Game Gear, but that's not to say it was without incredibly fun games. This was Sega after all. We know how the dust settled. At the time of the Game Gear's discontinuation, Nintendo outsold Sega 6-1. But now that it's all over, it's a great time to look back, pop in our rechargeable AA's, and settle the more important questions. Like how specifically in 1991, who had the best Formula 1 racing game? While us North Americans have never cared much for Formula 1, that didn't stop the rest of the world from sharing this passion. This was especially true for 1991, but of course it didn't start there. In 1979, Sega would release Monaco GP. In 1982, Namco released the incredibly successful Pole Position. In 1984, Nintendo published F1 Race, designed by its future president Satoru Iwata for the Famicom. Before Mario Kart cemented itself as the staple of the genre, F1 was what most people thought of when thinking of racing games. For the most part, the Game Boy had done a fantastic job at keeping genres covered for its first year in the market. Need an RPG? Sort of Hope should keep you busy. Sports games? Baseball, tennis, and golf are there for competent mobile offerings. There's even that Soviet game with the falling blocks that everyone's playing, but I can't put my finger on it. Oh well, I'm pretty sure it's not that important. One genre that took quite a bit of time to get over the market, though, was the racing genre. It wasn't until about a year into the Game Boy's life that we would get an actual racing game, and Sunsoft would even beat Nintendo to the punch in having an F1 game by a month in Japan. But being late to the party didn't hinder its excellence. F1 Race follows the tried and true method that many racing games were like at the time. Using perspective-based graphics, your car drives into a disappearing horizon and attempts to overtake other cars to get to first place. It's certainly not a new concept, but its execution can be applauded when looking back at the game that it shares its name with. The original F1 Race for the Famicom was also a horizon-based racer, but this was essentially just a score attack game. While there were other racers on the track, they served little more than obstacles to be avoided. This was fine for 1984, and in fact, it was great when considering the alternatives at home, like Pole Position and Pit Stop 2. A little more would be needed, though, when it came to handheld in 1991. F1 Race on the Game Boy surpasses the Famicom version in almost every aspect. The first word that comes to mind when thinking about F1 Race is presentation. As the car starts, the engine revs, you pick up speed and easily blaze past the first 3 or so cars in front of you. As you climb to get higher up the ladder, the music by Ryoji Yoshitomi breaks in, adding more tension to the race as it picks up. As you make turns, your car speed changes, and the engine rhythmically sputters as you wind around cutting bends. Finally, a safe clearing comes by, and you have the opportunity to punch the turbo and get ahead. As you cross the finish line, you celebrate and dance on the podium before saluting Mario himself as you go to the next course. F1 Race GB comes with two different cars to change around how smooth or fast you want to drive. While A is a more smoother ride, B has higher top speeds, but is much harder to control. Adding this with the lack of manual transmission, it seems like the design philosophy was not to burden the player with choice, but instead just providing a way of trying a different approach to things if they don't seem to be working out. It's a nice way of not overcomplicating gameplay, but this is also possibly a generous take. One thing that makes the game so polished as well are the small visuals that bring the whole package together. A subtle change is that each stage has different backgrounds. Yes, it's generic iconography of different geographic locations, but it adds a little bit of extra charm, especially when considering how every track on the Famicom edition was just a color palette switch. Additionally, every result of the race, be it single or multiplayer, has your cute little F1 driver always in an expressive pose to go along with the result. Last but not least, of course, is Nintendo's parade of different IPs. Characters like Samus, Pit, and Link all show up to give encouragement to go just another track further. It feels like a small hall of fame from its developer Nintendo R&D1, who I almost believe cheer F1 Race on despite not having a mascot of its own, believing that it's doing something special enough to stand up with the rest of them. The most controversial approach for F1, however, is its progression system. If you place anything other than first, you will need to repeat the level again. You can always play the other tracks in practice mode, but it's this difficulty that probably resulted with a lot of people only placing within the first 4 levels for a bulk of their play. The issue here is that it's near perfection that's needed. It can be argued that this certainly helps with replayability, and it also makes victory of these tracks something that makes you want to get up and run around the room. For a game that's so accessible, however, it makes you want to reset your Game Boy every time you take contact with an unlucky billboard. On the bright side, this game comes with a battery save pack in order to save what race you are currently on, so you can come back and begin again at a moment's notice, which is perfect for handhelds. Last, and certainly not least of course, is what F1 Race is really known for, that being its 4-player adapter that the game supported and shipped with in North America. Even with the neck of a goose, it's a weird thing to wrap one's head around that this for many was the first game that would be more than 2-player outside of an arcade. Only a year prior from its Japanese launch would be the release of the 4-player adapter for the NES. It's an interesting thing to humor then that this handheld console was close to the cutting edge of multiplayer pioneering. While we wouldn't see many other titles take advantage of the adapter, F1 Race holds up still incredibly well, even for a quick race with friends on a lunch break. One can only imagine that this tradition held true over 30 years ago. Where Nintendo's F1 Race became more of a pick-up-and-play experience for everyone, Sega caters to the more versed car fan for the Game Gear. Super Monaco GP was first released in the arcades in 1989, and was an absolute dream from a visual and technical standpoint. Being as high-tech as it was, compromises had to be made for the home console editions in 1990. Interestingly, instead of doing a close-to-arcade conversion like they would try with Super Thunderblade and Altered Beast, Sega wisely chose to make Monaco GP at home a larger experience. Whereas Super Monaco GP on the arcade only features one course to contest for pole position and compete in, both the Mega Drive and Master System would feature courses from the 1989 F1 World Championship. Super Monaco GP for the Game Gear would release in late 1990 in Japan, as the launch title for the system. Since the Game Gear shared so much similarity to the Master System's hardware, Monaco GP is technically an adaptation of that version. It's a strange position for a game to be as a port of a port and a downgrade of a downgrade that likely muddied the waters to its reception. Add this to the expectation of what gamers are looking for in a new console. This was the Game Gear's first impression, as the console looked to compete with the popular Game Boy. Needless to say, the cards were stacked against it. But how does it look and play? The answer is surprisingly well. The first thing you'll probably notice is that the Game Gear version looks much better than the 8-bit cousin due to its much higher color palette on the Game Gear. The screen real estate is used well with a map of the track at the top and a colorful horizon and card to go hither and thither. The Game Gear version even feels a little bit faster than the Master System version. A nice thing to highlight is the ability to customize your wings, tires, and engine. You can even switch between an automatic and manual transmission, which is a nice gesture, but then it leads down the slippery slope of becoming a person who advocates driving stick over automatic in real life. For that reason, I decided to play it safe. The meat and potatoes of the game, of course, is the Grand Prix, where you go through 16 memorable tracks on a career to make it to first. Qualifying under the threshold will result in a game over, but so long as you do moderately alright and don't spin out too often, you'll be okay to keep going. Points are allocated based on placements, and so while placing poorly on one track might not be great, it's not something that will ruin your run. From a list of smaller gripes, the omissions of its Master System intro is a bit of a shame, as it was a fun homage to the 1979 Monaco GP. If your car spins out, or even if you are stopped at all, you can still move your car freely to the left and right of the screen with no velocity. Finally, it's a bit of a shame that there's no battery save pack to continue your Grand Prix mode, or save your best times. But hey, at least you have the manual provided in a booklet to mark them down. However, outside of beating your own times and your own score, the game strangely feels almost lonely. Controversially for the Master System, the game featured 2 windows of play at all times. This was likely to account for the ability of 2 players, but in doing so, it made for such a smaller space of play for just going solo. While not optimal for players' vision, it was populated with a computer player who would drive the race as its own car and compete in the rankings along with other names on the scorecard. This addition made for a great opponent as a substitute for a rival feature included in the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive version. Of course, racing is great, but the stories that come with it are what make F1 seasons so memorable, and the idea of competing against another unique car around your same level makes the action even more tense. The 1989 season, to which the tracks are from, was the same year that the Prost and Senna rivalry was at its hottest, and its Suzuka race is one of the most contentious races in F1. For the Master System and Genesis releases, competition was the drive of the game. If we were to go back to the Game Gear, unless you had a friend with a gear-to-gear co-op cable, these heated personal matches probably wouldn't happen. And given the popularity of the portable, it seems like these matches have a slim chance of happening now. On the surface, F1 Race and Super Monaco GP may feel like the same game, but in closer inspection of the origins, we can see the philosophy of what the development team wished to prioritize in terms of gameplay. F1 Race was developed by a team who had a history of creating brand new experiences to video games. It had a more simplified method of customization and difficulty, but the extra appeal of using familiar characters and animated poses of the racer goes a long way in making the game feel like it has life. It intentionally came with a cable to race against others, as the developers understood that when the dust settled, the races against friends and family would be what kept people coming back. Super Monaco GP plays very well, and feels like a proper F1 experience on the go. If that's all you're coming in expecting, you'll get just that, but not much more. Its problem, however, is that it doesn't break from the mold that it came from, and leaves out a very important aspect. While I would say it plays a far bit better than F1 Race, and it's certainly more fair, it doesn't convey enough to outsiders as to why it's a game worth playing, and unless you know people very into the Game Gear, it will be a difficult proposition to find a rival to share the trials and tribulations that each track provides. If you include the Game Boy, Super Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and GBA, there's almost 200 million consoles to play F1 Race on. The game is incredibly cheap on retro markets, and is not only a great piece of history, but has the draw that makes you feel like you can pull it out of your pocket and kill 5 minutes, even if it only means getting a little bit more practice on that stupid 4th race. Super Monaco GP has the same addictive draw and cheap price, but it's not only a much harder console to find, but a much harder console to carry around. On the other hand, its portability is made up for its ability of play and comfort while it's dark. While historically F1 race is certainly more significant, I would say which is best between the two is what you personally enjoy. A good litmus test for choice is asking yourself, what's more important, the 1989 season of F1 or a cameo of Donkey Kong? The choice is yours. Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you like what you see, make sure to hit subscribe so you can see when new uploads are released.